Part 3. Then, out of that blue we all refer to, Hetty made contact. With Skype, not her usual modality. After their usual preamble, she asked if he remembered his offer to fund any Miss Marple adventures that might come her way. He certainly did. She outlined the mystery, or what she knew of it so far. Andrew was intrigued and said it was better than the entire last season of George Gently. Hetty chuckled at the reference. Truth be told, she couldn't wait to get to Barcelona and look for him. Andrew suggested a couple of wigs and some big sunglasses. Sure, he'd pony up for the hotel rooms. What else did she need? Well, it wasn't part of the investigation per se, but a weekend in Bilbao to do the museum would be tickety-boo. Sure thing. Maybe he'd slip over some weekend himself. Love to see it. So what were her suspicions so far? That he's slowly poisoning her, but in such small doses it will never be noticed? And who was it again? Oh, his stepmother, right. And she's the one with the funds? Oh, the property, Cotswolds. 16th century manor house with more than a touch of dry rot? Oh yes, very Miss Marple. When are you leaving? As soon as you can get a flight? Okay, just send me the bill when you get back. Oh, and Skype me while you're there. Then, while awaiting V's next official lodging of complaint, due any hour now that Dennis was off on some venture, a breaking news story caught his fancy. It was the type of sleaze Canadians thought endemic to the Yankee enterprise, along with mansions that consumed people for breakfast and automatic weapons legally owned by psychopaths that could devastate an entire dining establishment in seconds. But here we had what was shaping up to be your classic homegrown family affair, the true north tying one on for freedom. A complaint had been lodged against Mitchell Rumpus, the charming and irrepressible host of a late-night hour of interviews and satirical sketches called Enough Already, that was apparently ripping the lid off the Nielsen ratings for that period. Andrew could vaguely recall seeing at least some of one episode where a sketch riffing on metrosexuals had completely escaped him, but the media shadow cast by Mitchell was no secret, as his radio show of the previous year, Non-Negotiable, had, with its cleverly crafted takedowns of several American blowhards, boosted him into orbit. Andrew distinctly recalled the show where, in frustration at the rap star Ape Fruit, he'd smashed his CD against the interview table when he wouldn't take back some chastity and Kanakistan jibe. Ape had left the studio in a fury, but social media had immediately exploded with a coast-to-coast clatter of Yankee go-home tirades that ensured Mitchell's folk hero status and quick ascent into the rarefied spheres of late-night TV. The complaint? Well, the 19-year-old daughter of his newish wife had alleged sexual improprieties of a going-all-the-way nature. Andrew thought he recalled the wife, Amber Pendergrast, but her controversial podcast, Armed to the Teeth, said to be gaining traction these past few months, especially in the States, where its fearless feistiness seemed to slot in nicely beside all those right-wing ravers who thought English was just fine for Jesus when he wrote the Bible, meant nothing to him. What the heck? What was a podcast anyway? One of those thingies people put on their phones? Podcast phones? Yeah, maybe. Not surprisingly, Mitchell had been replaced as host until the air had cleared. An up-and-coming hip-hop artist by the tag Man Up was his replacement. It intrigued Andrew to hear of Man Up's roots in Montreal, where his last single, Moi Aussi, had been the fastest-selling download in a year. All these artistes with their careers tumbling about. With that one National Post article, Andrew felt projected into tabloid heaven. In the middle of Googling names for some further detail, he got bored and switched to YouTube for some musical relief. First watching a live duet by Bruce Springsteen and Paul McCartney, joyously belting out that Beatles classic, I Saw Her Standing There, and then, for no apparent reason, settling on Terry Riley's hypnotizing organ recital, Purge and Surgery Dervishes, which removed him from any semblance of gossipy silliness he'd been wallowing in and ushered in a world of murmuring abstractions, shuffling around the thrones of melody. Swinging his legs onto the couch for complete submission, he became something of an abstraction himself, more than likely nodding off and nodding back for the final few minutes. Now that was better. Something like a tiny beep told him a Skype was waiting. Or something. It was a text from Janet. Arrived safely on the left coast with showers chasing the sun. Dad has had a small stroke, but he seems well and truly functional. Mum worried, so I didn't mention trial, etc. All good, love and hugs. He replied, all's well as here. Miss you, but please have gobs of guiltless fun. He wondered if she would Skype that night. Probably, but maybe jet lag would collapse her good intentions. Hours passed in amusing trivialities. Various messes were tidied and a couple of new ones started. Laundry was piled in the laundry room, ready for the next courageous move. Toothpaste tubes were wiped clean, sinks scrubbed. The clean sweep ladies were due in the morning and he didn't want them to think he was a complete pig. As he was futzing about, he recalled one of his caffeine dispensary pals asking if he cleaned his own man cave. He'd laughingly denied any ownership of such at the time, but could now see his cache of well-appointed spaces, currently empty of all that attractively undulating animation visitors arrived with, was not much more than a collection of said caves knitted together for his temporary convenience. He shook off this troubling notion by escaping into the conservatory, where taking up residence by the fountain slowly refreshed his outlook. He felt complete and whole and only slightly guilty for his life of lazy luxury. Hey, 2 of his African orphans had emailed that very day, detailing, in not half-bad English, the improvements in their village school his generosity had brought about. Hardly anyone knew of this line of philanthropy. It was his little secret, shored up against his crumbling humility. Okay, he did tell his mother, but Margaret could be relied on not to hush up on that one. Or actually, to hush up on that one. No bragging, he'd insisted. Thoughts of the evening repast raised their head. After sifting through the options, he felt ready for some British comfort food at one of the pubs. And very comfortable it was, the liver and bacon with onions and mash with gravy, the pint of Guinness slowly losing its head, and not one bike-riding vegan to disapprove. It was a quiet evening at the Bishop's Knickers, the kind of quiet that enabled a spot of reading to easily surf the various conversations softly cruising the room. Andrew missed the cheeky charm of his favourite waitress Teresa, who had apparently moved on to bigger and better things, the posh deli Zorro's to be exact, but tales of the dastardly and ruthless Russian oligarchs and their henchmen served to populate his imagination as his tummy swelled with satisfaction. The tortures they exacted upon one another in pursuit of untarnished virility was appalling. He walked it off, his disgust that is, down by his favourite lake, on this occasion grinned at by a lopsided crescent moon. Maybe he could join the mermaids riding the surf and be rid of all this earthly madness. He'd recently read a book that suggested he could do that very thing should he be so inclined. Sylphs and sprites all seem to be gathered under an umbrella of elementals these days, and more humans seem to be seeing them, or at least saying they were seeing them. Angels, fairy dust and the like were much more easily found on Amazon than they were in the old bookstore days. Mind you, an admission of interest was just as likely to render you inadmissible to adult society as it ever was. Talk of aliens and hybrids was almost tolerated with a tickle of chuckles, but fairies and elves, forget it. Andrew, given the drift of his life right then, would likely forget it too, but there was no doubt in his mind interest had been aroused and would be pursued at a more suitable juncture. What was the darn book called again? Elemental Essence? On the Off-Ramp to Angels? Oh well. Back at the pile, another linger by the lapping waters. Yes, he stretched out to read. The current McCall Smith was upstairs, bedside, and he couldn't be bothered trotting up to fetch it. So he reached to the coffee table where a recent New Yorker lay in waiting. Well, at least he could stop wondering what might happen next. He had returned to the lost Eden of inquiring intelligence and well-crafted writing. Nothing else mattered? Not really. It was all subsumed in the illuminated text. Or so his thoughts rambled as he read. Of course he dozed off, dramatically increasing the lifespan of the lone fly that had been aimlessly buzzing about. Janet's Skype call had awakened him from an exhilarating flying dream where clouds seemed to be his only companions. Disoriented and, let's face it, dopey, he saw the image of her hand fondling her breast and the sounds of her sighing, and it all kind of went downhill from there. Accelerating downhill to a mushy thwap. Carelessly orchestrated, of course. Later, tidied up for, well, no one, a Bowmore Pollard and readied for consumption, which for Andrew translated into some sacred moments of loving contemplation, a DVD selected and inserted, and his fatal error, checking his email. And sure enough, there was an anxious message from Bronwyn concerning a dream, a very vivid one, in which her beau executed the dealer as was alleged and was caught, tried and sentenced to life without parole. Could it possibly be true, she agonized? And what was Andrew's impression? He was psychic after all, wasn't he? Shit, that was the last thing he needed right now. He shut off his laptop emphatically and settled in to watch, for perhaps the 5th time, Altman's great farcical country house murder mystery, Gosford Park. Where's that parallel universe when you need one? Why, said the film buff, it's right here. With Fellowes' effortless plotting and Altman's impeccable direction, the amiable farce unfolded with measured glee to the soul-ensnaring singing and foppish futility of Stephen Fry's dopey detective sparring into a cosmic giggle of epic proportions. One did not need to encompass some appalling war or major social upset to portray human frailty at all its edifying silliness. One need no more than a country house weekend get-together. As usual, Andrew felt like Mr. Smartypants thinking this. But hey, it felt good to be pretentious once in a while, even if he didn't write for Film Comment. Having already cruised dangerously close to sleep during the parade of moving images, the short trip to bedtime seemed like a smart move. And nodding off some minutes later, he congratulated himself for having the acute foresight to act on the impulse. No fluttering about in an overheated brain tonight. It was all downhill into the pleasant swamp of sleep, where he drifted contentedly without adventure until dawn. Why? Well, Chapter 4, Dawn Unending. Why did he ever check his email before the morning splendor of lapping waters and honeyed coffee rubbed out that residual fog of resistance to the petty demands of the day? It was always a downer, a buzzkill of epic proportions. Okay, that was a bit over the top. After all, it was only a short text from Dennis, saying nothing more than, I've got something that might interest you. More to follow. But Andrew knew that the price of intrigue would outweigh its season of fascination. Being the Zen prince about to do precisely nothing at the edge of the ancient lake fit like a glove he was not about to remove, no matter how funky the puzzle his fingers might explore. Thus the message was not answered. But before he got into another tussle about private nirvanas and attachments to them, he returned to the generously appointed domicile and proceeded to dither with this and that until the clean sweep ladies arrived with their usual fanfare. Boyfriends and shiftless exes seemed to be the topic of the day. As he waved off comment, they laughed their way upstairs. He rode on the wave of their chuckles for some time. Eventually it carried him to the news of the morning. Amber Prendergast had disappeared, or at the very least could not be found, not by Mitchell Rumpus, her daughter Melody, or any of her regular contacts in the podcast universe. The baby Gabriel, whose gurgles and coos were featured in a recent edition on whales imitating infants, had also gone missing. Nanny had arrived to an empty condo where hints of a hasty departure were obvious. Mitchell and Melody, holding hands imploringly, had given statements to the police before holding a news conference that previous night at 11. Andrew couldn't tell, not really, if he actually smelled a rat or wanted to sniff one out to avoid the inevitable request from Dennis. A sex scandal were safer than international intrigue any day, way safer. And a stroll through Browenton's friendly streets was even safer. He left a note for the ladies and was quickly off. Strolling often instilled a sense of calm, mainly due, he supposed, to the rhythm of footsteps, the elimination of the jog, the march, and the stride, with all their purposeful overtones, and left you sashaying through your own shifts of mood, which usually turned out to be about as relevant as clouds passing under the sun. And that was about the level of relevance he was ready for. The day, he figured, as about to come crashing about his shoulders, the day with all its melodramatic demands insisting on reaction and response. Would it be a text, a phone call, an email, perhaps an acolyte of Dennis's rappelling down a rope from a helicopter onto his lawn? Nah, two's James Bond for Ceases, and besides it would gobble up an entire quarter's budget. Maybe one of those virtual reality thought bubbles, holographically projected from some egg carton-lined panic room deep in the bowels of some long-forgotten dusty department. He'd heard whispers about such from Dennis, who claimed several unnamed agencies were on the verge of developing. No, not the orbs New Agers were raving about as they snapped away at kids' birthday parties. Something more high-tech, likely, fiddled with in secret labs by secret people until they fit into some predetermined puzzle the techies thought possible. Hey, that was pretty clever. He should write that down somewhere. Impress himself when he was feeling a bit down. Down in the dumps, or down in the mouth. Certainly not pre-road downs. Or been down so long it looked like up to him. Oh no, none of that. Crossing the river, he looked out to the lake spreading out on the horizon. That would never change, regardless of his mood. The library beckoned and in he went. An armchair in the New Yorker with the Economist at his elbow and Janet safely out west. A gentleman's retreat, without all that fusty baggage of private clubs and hushed oaken interiors. He could certainly afford it, but he was still too much of a lefty to throw in his lot with the elite. An hour's information and opinion gathering passed in the quietly public bliss. And knowing it would soon end made it all the sweeter. Oh, that magic feeling, nowhere to go. The dawn could be unending if you made your denial of time watertight. Later, of course, it would all unravel. In moments all would be lost and the agitation would stir the pot as if I had just stepped outside for a smoke. At least he got a lunch break of sorts, a sandwich and a salad served up by an art student, a cartoonist apparently, in a flowered miniskirt and boots. A small flutter of flirtation passed between them, enough to make Andrew feel all warm and fatherly. As he strolled off toward the lakeside, his serenity yet intact, he wondered what sort of man would take it on himself to seduce such a timid flower of youth. He'd met a few back in the day who'd bragged that they might have if given the chance, or had when the dice rolled their way. A father in the cap of their manhood, he'd supposed, when he could find time to believe them, which was rarely. At the lakeside park, he found a shady spot, parked, eyes closed, eyes open. The vista was appealing, the soundtrack consistent, the squeals of preschoolers on roundabout and swings. He let himself sail off into sweet oblivion. Later that afternoon, he would look back lovingly at this interlude. The 4 p.m. headlines had intrigued. Amber Prendergast had been rushed to St. Eustace after an apparent overdose, although how that knowledge had become public remained unexplained. Reporters were still seeking verification. In Russia, another of Putin's critics had been silenced, and a spontaneous demonstration was already brewing in downtown Moscow. 2 drive-bys had been recorded since lunchtime, one in a mall parking lot in Markham, the second about 2 hours later on Kingston Road. Police were saying no connection as yet, no provable connection, Andrew thought. Tit-for-tat slayings had been a feature of Toronto street life for years now. Yet the PR continued to pump up the city as a safe place to live, one of the safest in North America, and the cleanest, funnest tourist destination north of, well, they never did say quite where. Guys were getting whacked midday in public restaurants, cafes, parked cars, as the city and sidewalk life hurried on around them. It was not the Toronto Andrew arrived in decades before, but he felt like some woosy recalling it. Doubtless readers of hard-boiled detective fiction felt right at home, or Shakespeare tragedies for that matter. And to the recent refugees from various war zones, well, Toronto must feel like paradise, especially when the temps rose above -15. What would it take for a city to sit up and pay attention? Especially after the Rob Ford circus, when the absence of cringing was about all we could hope for. Something trendy. Andrew figured a breastfeeding Muslim woman getting clipped in the crossfire in a Tim's maybe, that icon of Canadian identity, might just be the fire starter we needed. By 6 that day, the mystery had moved on up. Reporters looking for Coates had found Mitchell Rumpus's condo empty and the daughter nowhere to be found. Andrew was fussing over supper choices and fantasizing about warrants being issued when Dennis called. Might he come over later with a package that required the kind of safe handling only Andrew could provide? Andrew suggested tie, as he had finally settled between his arguing whims. How about an hour? And an hour it was, more or less. He was mulling over his salad and pushing his way through Le Carré's memoir, The Pigeon Tunnel, when Dennis pulled up a seat. Recognizing the title, he expressed admiration. He'd raced through it on a 6-hour flight from Europe, and now Alex had it by his bedside. Although Dennis suspected he was rereading the same chapters and forgetting. An ominous sign. Andrew nodded, but found himself thinking that it might be just what they needed, a less than perceptive Alex. V sent her regards. Andrew smiled at Dennis's smile, and each assumed that the other understood. Guys, women might agree in disgust. They never share. But gentleman was their assumption, gentleman's agreement, gentleman's honour. Sharing was in the eyes, and silence. Well, I have a Monet in the back seat, wrapped in brown paper, of course. His wine arrived, and they both smiled at the waiter. Well, I hope it's one of my favourites. If it is, I'm not hiding it in the attic, as you'll likely want. Art should be admired, and great art should be honoured in all costs. Andrew was thinking of that German chap, son of a Nazi, with all that stolen art under his bed for decades, finally nabbed a while back. Selfish little prick, had been his silent assessment. Well, as long as you hide it when the cleaning ladies are there, and any other questionable colleagues. Andrew suspected girlfriends of casual acquaintance were being hinted at. Janet was hardly casual, but now was not the time to be assigning her roles. He asked some predictable questions about the provenance of said item.